A gentle breeze rustled the bare branches outside the large bay window, scattering the last few amber leaves across the frosted lawn. Inside, silence reigned. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but reminds you just how empty a house can feel. The Campbell estate stood quietly in the hills of Vermont, surrounded by pine trees and a sweeping view of Lake Willoughby. Its still waters reflecting the fading warmth of a winter sunset. To anyone passing by, the house looked like a dream. Manicured gardens, a driveway that curved like a ribbon, and lights glowing softly from the rooms within. But inside, it felt more like a museum of memories than a home. On the second floor, in a study that overlooked the lake, Richard Campbell sat alone, a glass of water untouched in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. At 67, Richard was a man whose life had once been the epitome of the American dream. He was the founder of a groundbreaking medical technology company, Neurovita, and for 3 decades, his inventions had changed lives, won awards, and padded every business magazine from Forbes to Wired. There was a time when hospital systems across the country waited eagerly for his next move. When CEOs offered blank checks just to get into a meeting with him. But none of that mattered anymore. Because now, Richard was dying. 3 weeks ago, after months of unexplained fatigue and shortness of breath, he had finally relented and undergone a full cardiac evaluation at Massachusetts General Hospital. The results were unequivocal: advanced dilated cardiomyopathy. His heart was barely functioning at 30% capacity. It's like trying to run a marathon on a broken engine, his cardiologist had said, gently but firmly. The words echoed in his mind every night since the options were few and grim: an extremely high-risk surgery, or waiting for a donor heart that might never come in time. Neither scenario offered comfort. He could feel the weight of time pressing harder with each passing day, and unlike his younger days, no amount of intellect, money, or innovation could outwit this final opponent. He stood, walked slowly to the window, and watched a squirrel dart across the snow-covered driveway. Winter had always brought him peace in the past. Now it just reminded him how fragile everything was, how easily warmth could disappear. The silence in the house wasn't new. It had begun a decade earlier when his wife, Grace, died of ovarian cancer. They had tried for children, but fate hadn't allowed it. After she passed, Richard threw himself into work, into legacy, into distraction. But now, legacy seemed like a hollow word. What use was a legacy if there was no one left to carry it forward? He moved through the hallway, past framed photographs, his wedding day, award ceremonies, a picture with President Carter, a faded, black and white of him with his parents outside a hardware store in Indiana. Achievements. Yes. Proof of life, well lived. Perhaps. But connection. None of it filled the ache in his chest that wasn't caused by disease, but by isolation. He made his way to the kitchen. The housekeeper had left a tray of soup and crackers earlier that morning, but he hadn't touched it. His appetite had become as unreliable as his heartbeat. He glanced at the kitchen clock, 6:47 p.m., and felt a familiar restlessness. He couldn't sit still tonight. Something in him, some old instinct that once made him take midnight flights just to close a deal, stirred again. Not for business. This time, for something unnamed, unshaped, just a need to move, to feel something real again. He grabbed his coat, a navy wool blend lined with soft flannel that Grace had once gifted him, and stepped into the night. The cold bit into his skin, sharp and immediate, but it was welcome. Real. He didn't call for the driver. Instead, he climbed into the old Jeep Cherokee he hadn't touched in months. The one Grace loved to take on autumn drives through the countryside. The roads outside Lyndonville were quiet, lit only by the occasional porch light or the distant glare of a convenience store. He didn't have a destination, just a direction. He turned onto a narrower road that ran parallel to the Passumpsic River, passing old barns, shuttered diners, and snow-laced mailboxes, leaning under the weight of December. As the road curved near a stretch of state forest, his headlights caught a flicker of movement. Reflexively, he slowed down, heart skipping slightly, though he could no longer tell if it was from surprise or simply the strain of being. And that's when he saw them. 5 small figures huddled beside a wet RV parked at the edge of an abandoned rest stop. The windshield was cracked, the tires half flat, and a faint stream of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney that looked like it had been fashioned from old soda cans. The tallest of the group, maybe 14, stood facing him, arms wide like a protective barrier in front of the others. The younger ones clung to each other beneath layers of mismatched jackets and tattered blankets. One of them was holding a paper coffee cup, like it was a sacred treasure. Another was drawing invisible shapes on the frost-covered ground. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just pity. He had seen poverty before. He had funded shelters, sponsored programs, been the face of a dozen charitable initiatives. This was different. This wasn't about statistics or causes. This was about now. 5 lives suspended in the bitter cold, trying to exist without being noticed. And yet, here they were, noticed, seen. He parked the Jeep slowly and turned off the engine. For a moment, he sat there, unsure what to do. He could drive away, tell himself he saw nothing, return to his quiet house and wait for the next medical report. Or, maybe this was the moment. The moment something shifted, not just in the story, but in the soul. The air outside was freezing, but Richard opened the door anyway. "Hey there," he said, voice firm but soft, hands visible, empty. "Don't worry. I'm not with the cops, just driving." The boy didn't move. "It's too cold to be out here. Is that thing even warm inside?" he asked, nodding toward the RV. Silence. Then, a small voice, barely above a whisper. "We're fine." Richard stepped closer, pausing to look each of them in the eye. What he saw wasn't just hardship. It was resilience. Raw, unscripted resilience. The kind that reminded him of the early days when he pitched investors with nothing but an idea and borrowed faith. Something inside him stirred, not out of charity, but from a yearning deeper than logic. A yearning to matter again. Not as a founder, not as a name on a wing of a hospital, but as something real. "I've got a place not far from here," he said quietly. "It's warm. There's food, blankets, beds, just for the night. You can decide after that what you want." They didn't answer, but they didn't run either. Which, in a moment like this, was everything. He opened the car door and waited. A beat, then another. And slowly, the tallest boy took a single step forward. As the car door closed behind the last of them, and the engine hummed to life again, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Not quite joy, not quite fear, but it was alive. It was something. The snow continued to fall gently as the headlights cut through the night. And 5 children, and 1 broken man began a journey neither of them could have foreseen. And so, without warning, the house that had once felt like a tomb was about to become the start of something entirely new. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, soft flakes drifting down like silent witnesses as the Jeep carved its way through the back roads of Caledonia County. Inside the vehicle, the silence was thick, not the familiar, empty stillness of Richard's home, but something new, tentative, uneasy. 5 young passengers sat in the back, pressed together in a huddle, too cold and cautious to speak. The warmth of the car's heater seeped slowly into their jackets. But it would take longer for it to reach their guarded hearts. Richard glanced into the rearview mirror. 5 pairs of eyes met his. Not all at once, not directly, but in quick, darting glances, like wild deer unsure whether to bolt or stay. The boy who had spoken earlier, the tall one, thin but solid in presence, sat closest to the door. His jaw was clenched, arms folded tightly, as if he were holding the rest of the world at bay. Beside him was a pair of twins, no older than 10, identical down to their stitched-up gloves and matching expressions of cautious curiosity. A 4th child, perhaps 12, leaned slightly toward the window, his fingers twitching across the glass as if sketching invisible lines. The youngest, a little boy no older than 5, rested his head on one of the twins' shoulders, eyes wide and unblinking. They hadn't spoken a word since getting in. Richard didn't press. He understood fear. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the quieter kind. The kind that lives in the pit of your stomach and makes you second-guess every moment of safety. The kind he had felt in the hospital room, staring at his own x-rays. The kind he had ignored most of his life, and now saw reflected in these kids. He took the long road home, giving them time. Time to look out the window, to watch the world unfold in warm amber lights and gently falling snow. They passed homes decked with Christmas wreaths, diners with steamed-up windows, and churches preparing for Sunday morning service. None of them seemed to belong to the 5 children in the backseat. Richard wondered what their story was, where their parents had gone, what had brought them to an abandoned RV with patched tires and broken windows. But he didn't ask. Not yet. By the time they turned down his drive, the snow had coated the landscape in a soft white sheet. The Campbell home stood ahead, golden light pouring from its windows like a silent invitation. The automatic gate opened, with a groan, and the children all tensed. "I know it looks like a castle," Richard said gently. "But it's not. It's just A house. A house with too many rooms and too few people. The Jeep came to a slow stop in front of the porch. Richard stepped out first, boots crunching on the snow. He walked round, opened the rear door, and waited. The tall boy was first again. He scanned the house, then turned to the others. A silent nod passed between them. One by one, they climbed out hesitantly, like refugees entering a foreign land. The smallest clung to the twins' hand, his breath forming fragile clouds in the cold. The front door opened before they reached it. Mrs. Eloise Harlan, the longtime housekeeper, stood there in her burgundy cardigan and apron dusted with flour. Her eyes widened as she took in the group 5 children. Ragged, dirty, and out of place against the stately backdrop of stone columns and potted evergreens. But to her credit, she didn't speak. Not right away. "Evening, Eloise," Richard said, voice calm. "We'll need 5 extra plates at the table tonight, something warm." Eloise blinked, then nodded. "Of course, Mr. Campbell." He turned to the kids. "You can come in. No one here bites. Not even the house." The foyer was warm and filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and baking bread. The children hesitated on the threshold, eyes darting from the chandelier overhead to the polished hardwood floors beneath their tattered boots. Richard waved them in. "This way," he said, guiding them to a bench by the mudroom. "Let's get you out of those coats. Don't worry, we'll find something dry and warm for each of you." One of the twins, the one with a slight scar above his brow, pointed timidly at a painting hanging above the staircase. It was an oil portrait of a woman with auburn hair and soft eyes, seated in a garden chair, a book in her lap. "She was my wife," Richard said, pausing beside it. "She would have liked you." A hush settled over them. After a quick shower and a change into oversized flannel pajamas, borrowed from storage, the children found themselves seated at a long oak dining table. Their backs straightened, unsure of the etiquette. Their eyes kept returning to the spread roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed carrots, fresh rolls, nothing fancy. But for them, it might as well have been a royal banquet. They didn't touch anything until Richard sat down and quietly picked up his fork. Only then did they begin, cautiously at first. Then with growing eagerness, Richard watched without speaking, letting them eat, letting them be. The little one, the 5-year-old, leaned toward Richard and whispered, "Do you have milk?" "Of course," Richard smiled. "Warm or cold?" "Warm," the boy said. Eloise appeared moments later with a small mug, hands steady, eyes still scanning the scene like someone trying to solve a riddle. Richard caught her gaze and nodded slightly. She understood. Whatever questions she had, she could ask later. After dinner, Richard showed them to the guest rooms, one for the boys, another for the oldest to stand guard in, as he clearly wished. 2. He handed them each a toothbrush and a small towel, simple offerings in this unexpected ritual of care. They said little, but their eyes began to soften. Later that night, Richard stood in his study once again, watching the snow fall through the wide window. Behind him, the house was no longer silent. He could hear the soft echo of young footsteps on wood floors, the gentle creak of beds settling under unfamiliar weight. A laugh quickly stifled from one of the twins. It wasn't joy yet, but it was something. He placed a hand over his chest, feeling the slow, uneven rhythm of his heart. Still broken, still dangerous, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of life within it. Not from medicine, not from science, but from meaning. Tomorrow would bring questions, decisions, perhaps resistance. But tonight the snow fell in silence, and the house was no longer empty. Somewhere upstairs, 5 children slept beneath warm quilts. And one man, long considered a giant, began to remember what it meant to be simply human. And as the wind pressed against the window panes, it didn't feel like a storm anymore. It felt like something arriving, something just beginning. The morning light spilled slowly across the hardwood floors of the Campbell estate, slipping through tall windows and brushing gently against the antique rugs, like a whisper. In the guest room at the end of the hall, 5 children stirred beneath a pile of flannel blankets, their first night in real beds in who knows how long. The room smelled faintly of lavender and fresh linen, the kind of details that children without homes never notice because they never have time to. For a moment, none of them spoke. There was a stillness, like a breath being held. The youngest, Toby, blinked sleep from his eyes, unsure if he was still dreaming. Caleb and Connor, the identical twins, sat up first, their small hands reaching instinctively for each other. Micah, the quiet artist, was already awake, sketching something on the back of a breakfast napkin he'd saved. using a hotel pen he kept hidden in his sock, and Jackson, the eldest, the one who had taken it upon himself to protect them all, was standing by the window, arms folded, jaw set, watching the lake through a veil of frost. "This place isn't real," Caleb whispered. "It's real," Jackson replied without turning. "We just don't know why yet." Downstairs, the house was alive in a way that no one quite expected. There was the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen, muffled footsteps from Eloise as she moved through the pantry, and the scent of buttermilk biscuits baking in the oven. Richard had always liked morning's quiet and clinical newspaper, coffee, and silence. But today, it felt oddly comforting to know someone else was waking under the same roof. The children descended the stairs slowly, one step at a time, as if the floor might vanish beneath their feet. When they reached the main hall, their eyes scanned everything: the marble fireplace adorned with pine garlands, the stained glass transoms above each door, the polished banisters that gleamed like rivers of honey in the light. It was a museum. To them, a fantasy world filled with unfamiliar luxuries. The dining room had been set with care. Plates, glasses, folded napkins. In the center of the table was a large plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and a carafe of orange juice sweating slightly in the morning warmth. A smaller plate held apple slices and granola, thoughtfully added by Eloise, who suspected some of the kids might be picky or shy. She watched from the doorway, arms folded loosely, not speaking, just reading the room the way only someone raised on quiet hospitality could. They didn't rush to the food. They looked to Richard, seated at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but attentive. He nodded once, and that was enough. The twins reached for toast first. Toby asked softly if the orange juice was real, not from a powder. Richard smiled and poured it into a small glass, sliding it toward him without a word. Micah took a fork but didn't eat. He was watching the sunlight pass through the stained glass overhead, mesmerized. And Jackson, seated last, didn't touch a thing for several minutes. His eyes stayed on Richard, measuring him, trying to decide if this man, this stranger, was what he appeared to be. "Where do we go after this?" Jackson asked quietly. Richard met his gaze. "That's up to you." That was the first moment the children realized something about this place was different. Most adults had a plan for them. Most had limits, rules, boundaries, meant to keep kindness at a distance. But this man, who owned the largest house any of them had ever seen, was asking them what they wanted. It wasn't something they were used to. It wasn't something they knew how to process. After breakfast, Richard gave them a tour of the estate. Not as a display of wealth, but as an offering of space to explore, to breathe, to belong. He showed them the sunroom with old chessboards and faded atlases, the greenhouse out back, where Grace used to grow tomatoes and basil. The library filled with books she had collected over a lifetime. Each room carried a memory, and as he opened the doors, Richard shared bits of those memories without embellishment. "This used to be her chair," he said, pointing to an old leather recliner near the fireplace. "She'd read 3 books a week, non-fiction only. Said fiction made her sad." He wasn't performing. He was remembering. And somehow, the children respected that. Micah ran his fingers across the spines of the books. Connor found a globe in the corner and spun it like a roulette wheel. Toby curled up in the bay window, tracing the frost outside with his fingers. And Jackson, still skeptical, followed at the back of the group, watching Richard like someone tracking a wild animal. Later that day, Eloise brought out new clothes. Not brand new, but freshly washed and folded from the back closets. Soft sweaters, jeans with elastic waists, flannel shirts from winters past. The children accepted them without protest. They had learned long ago that warmth mattered more than pride. By evening, something had shifted. They weren't laughing yet, not really. But the silence had lost its edge. When the twins whispered to each other, it wasn't out of fear, but curiosity. Toby started asking questions about the paintings, about the stars he saw from the porch. Micah showed Richard a sketch of the greenhouse, rendered in fine pencil strokes on the back of a grocery list. "That's beautiful," Richard said. "It's not done," Micah replied softly. Richard nodded. "Then keep going." At bedtime, they went upstairs without being told. There was no resistance, no testing, just the slow unfolding of trust, like a door cracked open for the first time in years. Jackson lingered by the hallway, watching as Richard turned off the living room light. "You're not gonna send us back, are you?" he asked, voice quiet. "Not unless you want to go," Richard answered. Jackson didn't reply, but he nodded just once and disappeared down the hall. That night, The house was still again, but not hollow. The kind of stillness that follows a long exhale. Outside, snow continued to fall, layering the world in silence. Inside, under hand-me-down quilts and a roof not yet called home, 5 children slept without fear, and Richard, who once built machines to save strangers, now found himself watching over 5 lives that had wandered into his orbit. Uninvited, unplanned, but perhaps not without purpose. He didn't yet know what would come next, but he knew, with growing certainty, that something inside him had begun to thaw. The house wasn't just warmer now. It was becoming something else. It was becoming alive. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again over the Vermont hills, they would begin to face the questions no one had dared ask yet. Where do they go from here? And what does it mean truly to become a family? 3 days after the children arrived, the snowstorm finally broke. Outside the Campbell estate, the hills of Vermont gleamed under a fresh white sheet, like the world had been given a second chance. Inside, however, the weather was just beginning to change. Richard sat at the head of the long dining table, fingers pressed together, the remains of breakfast pushed aside, untouched. The house was quiet. The children were outside building a snowman, their laughter echoing across the yard. Jackson was giving orders. The twins were arguing about the shape of the nose, and little Toby had taken it upon himself to find the perfect hat. It should have brought a smile. It almost did. But Richard's mind was elsewhere. His cell phone buzzed. On the screen, the name read, Edmund Shaw, attorney at law. He let it ring twice before answering. "Morning, Richard," came the familiar voice, low and deliberate. The tone of a man who had read too many wills and broken too much bad news in his career. "I need to talk to you about the kids," Richard said. There was a pause. "I figured this was coming," Edmund replied. "You've kept them for 4 nights now. Any official arrangements?" "No, nothing official, not yet." Richard stood and walked toward the window, watching the children roll a snowball across the lawn. "I want to adopt them." Another pause, longer this time. "All of them, yes." Richard, Edmund exhaled slowly. "You do realize, this isn't like funding a hospital wing, or endowing a chair at Dartmouth. These are 5 minors. 5 lives. That's a legal labyrinth, even when you're healthy. And you're—" "I'm aware of my condition," Richard interrupted, quietly, but firmly. Edmund didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had softened. "You're not a reckless man, Richard, but this sounds emotional." "Of course it's emotional, but that doesn't make it irrational." Richard returned to his chair, sitting down slowly. His heart was pounding a little faster than it should, but he ignored it. "I spent 30 years building something I thought would outlive me, and it might. But buildings don't miss you when you're gone. These kids, they already matter to me. More than anything I've built. You're sure? As sure as I've ever been about anything." What followed over the next week was a storm no less relentless than the one outside. The legal process began with mountains of paperwork, background checks, medical clearances, psychological evaluations. Edmund raised every red flag imaginable. There would be questions of life expectancy, of guardianship, planning, of ethical oversight. Family court judges weren't known for taking chances on single men in their late 60s with advanced heart disease. And then came the voices from outside. Whispers in the boardrooms of Boston. Headlines in local columns. Tech Titan's last crusade. Campbell seeks to adopt 5 orphans. Some called it inspiring. Others called it reckless. A few, cruelly, called it publicity. The judgment didn't surprise Richard. He had lived in the public eye long enough to know how quickly admiration could curdle into cynicism. Some old acquaintances reached out with sympathy masked as concern. "Is this really the time for this kind of commitment?" one asked. "Why not sponsor them through a foundation? Let the system handle it." But Richard had seen the system. He had funded the system. And he knew with a gut certainty no headline could shake, that if he let these kids go, they wouldn't just disappear into paperwork. They'd disappear from each other. That, more than anything, haunted him. The idea that this strange, fragile family he had begun to stitch together, 5 pieces, each broken in their own way, could be torn apart by bureaucratic logic. So he pushed forward. He brought in child therapists to observe the kids. They passed every test with flying colors. Jackson showed emotional maturity well beyond his age. The twins, though mischievous, displayed clear attachment to Richard and each other. Micah, often quiet, responded best when allowed space to draw. Toby simply clung to Richard's leg during one of the interviews and refused to let go. The evaluator had smiled, made a note, and said nothing else. But the final question came not from lawyers or courts. It came late one night. From Jackson himself. He knocked gently on the study door. Richard looked up from a stack of documents. "Can I ask you something?" Jackson said. "Of course. Why us?" he asked. "You could have picked anyone. Or no one." Richard set the papers down. "I didn't pick you," he said. "You just showed up. On a night I didn't even know I needed saving. You weren't a project, Jackson. You were a reminder of that there's still something worth fighting for. Even now." Jackson nodded once, eyes lingering. Then he turned and walked away. No further questions. Start the next morning. Richard signed the first of the adoption petitions. Edmund was there, watching from across the table. "You know, this may be the most irrational, infuriatingly hopeful thing you've ever done," the lawyer said. Richard smiled faintly. "Let's hope it's contagious." And somewhere upstairs, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Running, laughing, living. It was no longer a quiet house. It hadn't been for days. In the middle of winter, in a house once filled only with silence and regret, something brave was taking root. A choice, not just to shelter, but to belong. Not just to rescue, but to stay. And as Richard placed the pen down and leaned back into his chair, he knew this wasn't just about giving the children a home. It was about giving himself one, too, maybe for the first time in his life. Outside, the sky had cleared, and far off in the distance, the snow-covered hills began to glow in morning light. Tomorrow would bring more battles, but for now, there was peace. And 5 children, once strangers in the snow, were finally one step closer to being something far more powerful, a family. The days grew longer, and the snow on the Vermont hills began to recede, revealing patches of green and brown beneath the white. Winter was loosening its grip, and inside the Campbell estate, something else was beginning to thaw. Not the walls or the pipes, but the children themselves. It didn't happen all at once. It came in moments, small and quiet, like the way the lake began to ripple under the ice before anyone noticed a change. At first, Richard simply watched. He observed them the way a scientist might watch the sky, patient, curious, knowing that patterns would reveal themselves with time. He wasn't looking for brilliance. He was just looking for signs that they were beginning to feel safe. But what he found was something else entirely. It started with Micah. One morning, while retrieving a book from the library, Richard noticed a pad of drawing paper left on the windowsill. On it, in smooth graphite lines, was an exact rendering of the greenhouse outside, not just a sketch, but a full, detailed composition. The panes of glass, the delicate curve of the ivy, the way the morning sun struck the eastern wall. It was all there, captured with an eye that saw more than shape. It saw emotion, atmosphere. Later that evening, Richard casually brought it up. "You left a drawing in the library," he said. Micah didn't look up from his plate. "Sorry. No, it was exceptional." Micah shrugged. "I just draw what I see." That was the first time Richard noticed the way Micah looked at the world. Not just observed it, but interpreted it. That night, he found Micah sitting alone in the sunroom, sketching a feather he had found earlier that day. Richard brought him a set of new pencils and a proper sketch pad. He didn't say much, just placed them on the table and said, "If you're going to draw, you might as well use the right tools." Micah didn't reply, but he didn't stop sketching either. A few days later, it was the twins, Caleb and Connor, who surprised him. They had taken to exploring the basement, which Richard had long ago converted into a mix of storage and workshop space. One afternoon, Eloise found them sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, surrounded by wires, batteries, and the remains of an old stereo system Richard had been meaning to discard. "They're going to electrocute themselves," she said, alarmed. But when Richard descended to investigate, he found something different. The twins had rewired the system, attached a Bluetooth module from a dismantled speaker upstairs, and connected it all to a salvaged tablet. Music played through the cracked speakers, clear and steady. "Where did you learn that?" Richard asked. Connor grinned. "YouTube," Caleb added. "And we like figuring things out." The basement soon became their laboratory. Richard, fascinated, cleared a section of the workbench and filled it with tools. He installed better lighting, brought in old electronics from storage, and quietly ordered a few kits online. Circuitry, robotics, basic programming boards. The boys took to it like fish to water. Within a week, they had built a rudimentary sensor that could detect light and temperature changes. By the end of the month, they were attempting to connect it to the thermostat. Meanwhile, little Toby was rarely alone. He followed Eloise like a shadow to the pantry, the laundry room, the greenhouse, always asking questions, always watching. But it was in the garden where he came alive. One afternoon, Richard found him gently brushing snow off the lavender plants that had just started to emerge. In his tiny hand, he held a dog-eared gardening book that had once belonged to Grace. "You like plants?" Richard asked. Toby looked up and nodded. "They talk," he whispered. Richard knelt down beside him. "What do they say?" "They tell you what they need. But you have to listen really close." Toby didn't speak like a he spoke like someone who had spent too much time being ignored, and had learned to listen instead. Richard began leaving small plant books on the coffee table. And every time he did, they were gone the next morning, tucked under Toby's pillow, or stacked neatly at his bedside. He started using words like photosynthesis and propagation. One evening, during dinner, he casually asked Richard if plants could be used to help sick people feel better. Richard answered, "Some do. That's how we got a lot of our medicine. In the first place." Toby nodded slowly. "Then I want to grow those." And then there was Jackson. He was the last to open up, but the first to understand the world beyond the estate. He read the newspaper every morning, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to know what was coming. One evening, as Richard prepared to join a video call with former colleagues regarding a failing biotech merger, Jackson asked if he could listen in. "Why?" Richard asked. "Because I think I need to learn this stuff." Richard let him stay. After the call, Jackson offered an observation about one of the partner firms. "They're stalling. They're hoping you'll buy them out because their own R&D failed. If you wait them out, they'll come to you." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You got all that from listening." Jackson shrugged. "You talk a lot, but they didn't. People who aren't nervous usually talk more." It was a level of perception Richard hadn't expected. Over the next weeks, he began testing Jackson, casually at first, then more deliberately. He would toss out a business scenario during breakfast, and Jackson would dissect it over oatmeal. His logic was sharp, his instincts even sharper. Richard started handing him articles about leadership, markets, negotiation. Jackson read them all. But more than talent, what emerged was something rarer, focused. Jackson didn't crave attention. He craved impact. He had spent his childhood protecting others. Now, given tools, he was learning to protect in other ways. One evening, after a particularly long day, Richard sat by the fire, a book unopened in his lap. Eloise brought him tea. The children were in their rooms, the house glowing softly with the quiet of a family at rest. "They're blooming," Eloise said. Richard looked up. "These children," she continued. "It's like watching wildflowers push through rock." He didn't answer right away. He was thinking of Micah's drawings, the twins' tangled wires, Toby's whispered questions about healing plants, Jackson's quiet assessments of the world. "No one ever gave them a chance," Richard said softly. "They were surviving. But now, they're becoming." Eloise nodded. "And so are you." That night, as the stars blinked awake in the sky above Lake Willoughby, the Campbell house no longer felt like a monument to the past. It felt like a greenhouse, warm, fertile, filled with possibility. And for the first time, Richard didn't feel like he was running out of time. He felt like he was just beginning to use it well. But what he couldn't know then, what none of them could, was how those hidden talents, those flickers of quiet brilliance, would soon become their greatest weapon in a battle far more personal than they'd ever imagined. A battle where love, resilience, and ingenuity would be tested, not in theory, but in the fire of real crisis. And the first spark of that trial was already on its way. The snow had melted completely now, leaving behind damp patches of grass and a garden waking up after too many months of sleep. The trees around the Campbell estate had started to bud, shyly at first, then all at once. Spring had arrived in Vermont, not just in the weather, but in the hearts of everyone inside the house. Richard found himself rising earlier these days, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The quiet rhythm of his mornings had changed, no longer sterile, silent, or filled with anxious thoughts about his failing heart. Instead, they began with movement, the soft thud of little feet racing down the stairs, the sound of cereal being poured, the smell of toast burning, because Toby insisted on doing it himself. It wasn't chaotic. It was life. Somewhere along the way, the children had stopped walking on eggshells. They argued now, over chores, over who got the last waffle, over who left the bathroom light on. But with the arguing came something deeper, comfort. They teased each other like siblings. They defended one another without hesitation. The invisible walls that once surrounded them had begun to fall away. Even Jackson, still the quiet guardian, had changed. He wasn't standing in doorways anymore, ready to flee. He was reading at the kitchen table while Toby drew next to him. He was showing Connor how to tie a necktie. He was helping Caleb write a pitch for a new kind of energy toaster they were building from scrap in the basement. The shift was subtle, but it was real. Jackson was no longer just protecting them. He was growing with them. Micah started leaving his drawings around the house taped to the fridge, slipped under Richard's door, even one quietly framed and placed in the hallway. A sketch of the family seated around the dining table, laughing, eyes warm, hands reaching for shared dishes. The caption, written in the corner in tiny, unsure script, read, "Home." But it wasn't just the children who were changing. Richard, too, found himself softening in places he didn't know was still alive. He laughed more, not the polite kind reserved for fundraisers, but deep, spontaneous laughter. Like when Toby stuck googly eyes on the butter dish, or when Connor accidentally reprogrammed the thermostat to speak in pirate slang. There were nights when he fell asleep on the couch, with one of the twins curled against his side. The television still flickering with half-watched documentaries. Yet the shadows hadn't vanished. They lingered in the quiet moments, in the way Richard sometimes placed a hand over his chest when he stood too quickly, or how he paused at the bottom of the stairs before climbing them, calculating his breath. His condition hadn't improved. The prognosis remained unchanged. The heart was still failing, slowly but steadily. No amount of laughter could replace cardiac muscle. He hadn't told the children the full truth. Not yet. But they were not oblivious. They noticed things. The way he sometimes winced. The sudden moments of silence when conversation would drift too close to the future. Jackson saw it most clearly. One night, while helping Richard clean the kitchen, he looked up and asked, "You ever think about not being here?" Richard dried his hands slowly. "Every day," he said, honestly. "But now I think about being here more than I think about the rest." Jackson didn't respond. He just nodded and kept scrubbing the dishes. Healing, Richard had learned, wasn't always about getting better. Sometimes it was about becoming whole. Even if your body wasn't. It was about making peace with what couldn't be changed and holding on tightly to what could, like laughter, memory, connection. Ella saw it too. She was quieter than usual. But there were moments when she lingered in doorways, watching them. Richard seated on the porch swing, surrounded by children, passing out slices of apple pie like communion. There was no word for it, really. Not parenting, not caretaking, just something truer, quieter, a shared becoming. One Sunday morning, Richard found himself walking through the garden with Toby. The boy was pointing out every bud, every leaf, telling stories about how each plant was waking up from their naps. When they reached the old wooden bench under the willow tree, Richard sat down, winded. Toby climbed beside him. "Does your heart still hurt?" the boy asked. Richard looked at him, surprised. But Toby wasn't afraid, just curious. "Sometimes," Richard admitted. Toby reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a tiny sprig of lavender. "I read that this helps." He placed it in Richard's hand. It was crushed slightly, but still fragrant. Richard closed his fingers around it, feeling its softness, its smallness, and how much love it carried. That evening, after dinner, Richard sat at his desk and wrote 5 letters, one for each child. He didn't seal them. Not yet, but he placed them in the drawer closest to his hand, just in case. Because love, he now understood, wasn't just about presence. It was about preparation, about giving others something to hold on to, even after you were gone. Upstairs, the twins were fighting over a flashlight. Micah was humming while sketching stars. Toby was practicing how to say photosynthesis with the proper emphasis. And Jackson was organizing the bookshelf alphabetically, just for fun. And Richard, he sat there and listened to the voices. The footsteps. The sounds of something ordinary and sacred all at once. He had built many things in his life, machines, companies, legacies. But this was something different. This was the kind of thing that healed you from the inside out. Not by fixing what was broken, but by reminding you that even in the shadows, life could still bloom. Tomorrow, he would face new questions, from doctors, from courts, maybe even from the children themselves. But tonight, the house was full. The air was warm, and every room glowed with the quiet light of love freely given and slowly received. And in the quiet between laughter and bedtime stories, something remarkable had settled into the home. A family. Imperfect, unlikely, unbreakable. Spring deepened its roots in Vermont, and the Campbell home had grown into a place alive with movement. The house hummed with the everyday sounds of a family finding its rhythm. School books opened on the kitchen island. Robotics kits spread out in the basement, and laughter echoing down the halls like wind through trees. But beneath the surface of this domestic calm, something quieter was unfolding. A secret. A mission. It began not with grand plans, but with a quiet observation. Jackson had noticed the way Richard sometimes pressed his hand to his chest when he thought no one was looking, how his steps grew slower by evening, how he excused himself from games of tag in the garden a little too early, or smiled a little too tightly when standing up from dinner. Micah noticed it too, in the way Richard sat longer by the fire after everyone went to bed, staring into the embers. Even Toby had stopped asking if Richard wanted to play chase. He now only asked if he wanted to sit and talk about the plants. None of them said anything aloud. Not at first, but one evening, after the others had gone to bed, Jackson sat in the library with Caleb and Connor. Papers and a laptop spread out across the coffee table. The twins were working on a small monitoring device. Just a science project, they claimed. But Jackson had an idea. What if we could help him? He asked, voice low. Caleb looked up. You mean with his heart? Jackson nodded. I've been reading about biometric sensors, about how some heart conditions need real-time feedback, monitoring, triggers for medication. What if we made something like that? Not a cure, just a backup system. Something smart. Connor raised an eyebrow. You mean like a wearable? We don't have medical gear. No, Jackson said, but we have curiosity, and brains, and each other. Micah entered quietly, having overheard just enough to know he wanted in. I could design the shell, he offered, make it wearable, elegant, not like a hospital thing. By the next morning, Operation Hope had begun, named by Toby, who had declared, if we're trying to save him, it has to be called something brave. They kept it secret. Not because Richard would disapprove, but because this wasn't about rules or permission. This was about doing something bold. Together, the basement became their headquarters. Richard thought they were just working on robotics, and in a way, they were. But layered between the wires and code was intention, the kind that comes only when fear is met with love. Caleb and Connor split the technical challenge between them. One focused on data collection, the other on signal processing. They scavenged materials from old projects and borrowed from Richard's storeroom, a drawer of heart rate monitors, a defunct smartwatch, fragments of circuit boards. Micah spent hours refining sketches, trying to make the device look like something wearable, not clinical, something that wouldn't remind Richard he was being monitored. He settled on a cuff, like an old-fashioned leather bracelet, but embedded with a discrete grid of microsensors and transmitters. The design was so sleek, it looked more like something from a boutique in New York than a medical prototype. Toby, for his part, took to studying plants with natural anti-inflammatory properties. He didn't fully understand the technology, but he was determined to make Mr. Richard feel better from the inside too. He brought tea to the basement every afternoon, made from lavender and mint, and things he insisted helped the soul and the cells. And Jackson, he coordinated it all. He researched clinical trials, reached out to a medical student at a local university using a pseudonymous email, and learned everything he could about Richard's condition. He even pulled Richard's old patent files from the company's public database, using his name and a bit of bluff to get access. There were setbacks, of course. A sensor shorted out. A software patch crashed the device. At one point, Toby dropped the prototype in the sink while trying to wash the sadness out of it. But they kept going. And through it all, they grew not just as a team, but as something closer than that. Their bond was forged, not in shared suffering, but in shared purpose. Each child had come from a world where survival meant isolation. Now, they were building something together, something with meaning, something that could save the man who had pulled them from the cold. The day they finished the first working model, the house was quiet. Richard was at a doctor's appointment in Burlington, and they had just hours before he returned. Micah finished the casing, a deep walnut tone with brushed steel lining. Caleb ran final diagnostics while Connor adjusted the signal thresholds. Jackson wrote a basic user interface on a repurposed tablet that could sync data and issue alerts. When they turned it on, and the screen lit up with a steady, pulsing rhythm, none of them spoke. They just watched in awe, in disbelief, as the line moved across the screen like a heartbeat. They didn't rush to present it. They waited, tweaked, tested. A few days later, Jackson knocked on Richard's study door. We want to show you something, he said simply. Richard followed them to the basement. The 5 children stood around a small table, looking nervous, proud, excited. Connor stepped forward and held up the cuff. "It's not perfect," he said, "but we think it could help." Richard picked it up, eyebrows raised, gently tracing the smooth edges. "What is it?" he asked. "A second chance," Jackson said. They explained the sensors, the feedback, the alert system, how it could detect strain, alert a paired device, and store real-time cardiac data, how it had been inspired by his own patents, refined with their own hands, built not just from science, but from love. Richard didn't speak for a long time. Then he placed the cuff on his wrist, fastening it slowly. It was light, almost unnoticeable. "I've spent my whole life building things for strangers," he said finally. "I never imagined someone would build something like this, for me." Caleb smiled. "You saved us first." Outside, the wind rustled through the new leaves, and sunlight danced through the basement windows. The pulse on the tablet ticked steady, gentle, strong. Richard looked at each of them, 5 faces. Once lost, now luminous with purpose. And for the first time in his life, he understood what legacy really meant. Not the kind carved in stone or written in headlines, but the kind that lives in people, in second chances, in the quiet courage of children who choose to fight for the one who chose them first. What none of them knew, standing there in the glow of that quiet triumph, was how soon that device and their unshakable bond would be put to the ultimate test. The storm was closer than they thought, but for now, there was only peace, and the steady sound of a heartbeat they weren't ready to lose. The late spring sun hung low over the Vermont hills, casting long shadows across the Campbell estate as the wind picked up, rustling the maple leaves just beginning to stretch into summer. It was a quiet kind of beautiful, the kind that made you think things might just stay this way forever. But beauty, Richard had learned, often camouflaged what was coming. Storms didn't always start with thunder. It began with a phone call. Richard was sitting on the back porch, the prototype cuff on his wrist, watching Toby attempt to explain photosynthesis to a bee. His phone buzzed quietly on the table beside him, and he answered without checking the caller ID. The voice on the other end was low and urgent. "Richard, you need to see this." It was Edmund Shaw, his lawyer and longtime friend. Loyal, cautious, precise. The kind of man who never raised alarms without cause. "Check your email," Edmund continued. "The file I just sent. It's from within the boardroom." Richard stood up slowly, heart rate already ticking upward. Inside, he opened his laptop and pulled up the message. There, in clean legalese and clipped business speak, was a leaked memo from the executive committee of Neurovita, the very company Richard had founded, nurtured, and eventually handed over when his health began to fail. The subject line chilled him. Proposal for acquisition by Axion. Biotech strategic elimination of founder influence. He scrolled, reading line after line. It was all there. The planned vote to approve a merger with Axion, a rival firm known for prioritizing short-term gains over long-term integrity. More than that, it outlined a strategic restructuring. Dissolve all remaining advisory contracts with known operational figures, including Richard Campbell. Even his voting shares were being contested under a clause buried in a amendment. At the bottom, one name stood out. Catherine Hale, interim CEO. Richard stared at the screen, his pulse thudding in his ears. Catherine had been his right hand for more than a decade. A brilliant systems strategist. Someone he had mentored, promoted, trusted with everything. She had been there when Grace passed. She had visited the estate more times than anyone else. He had once called her the future of the company. And now, she was leading the effort to erase him. He didn't speak of it that night. Not to the children. Not even to Eloise. He needed time to understand what it meant. But the truth sat inside him like a splinter. Small, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The next morning, he made a call to the Neurovita board's independent chair. The conversation was brief, professional, and devastating. "They believe you've stepped back, Richard," the man said. "Catherine's making bold moves. Investors like clarity, and your personal circumstances complicate that clarity." "My circumstances," Richard echoed. "You're a legend, Richard. But legends belong in museums." He hung up without another word. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a dismissal, as if everything he had built, every sleepless night, every innovation, every life touched could be boxed up and replaced with shareholder slides and quarterly returns. As if he, the man, had become the liability. But he wasn't angry. Not exactly. Beneath the initial sting, there was a deeper ache. The kind that came when someone you trusted used the very tools you gave them to dismantle everything you stood for. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, he sat with Jackson in the study, the fire casting shadows on the wood-paneled walls. "You ever trust someone too much?" Richard asked, his voice quiet. Jackson looked up from the chessboard. "I used to think trusting anyone was a mistake, and now, I think it's a risk. But sometimes, it's the only way to build anything." Richard nodded slowly. Then he slid a folder across the table. "Neurovita's being taken over. And Catherine, she's the one doing it." Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't ask why Richard was telling him this. He just opened the folder and began reading. The next morning, Operation Hope became more than a secret medical project. It became something bigger, something protective. Jackson organized the others with quiet precision. Micah began designing infographics and visual presentations. Caleb and Connor, using the data streams from Richard's cuff, built a dashboard that could project long-term health outcomes. Tied to Neurovita's therapeutic models, a direct threat to Axion's shallow strategies, Toby helped organize the notes, translating complex terms into simpler language so grown-ups could understand. They weren't just building a defense. They were building a case. Richard watched in awe, even as his heart continued its slow, invisible decline. They weren't asking for orders. They were leading. He called Edmund again. "I want to fight this," he said. "Then you'd better be ready to make it personal," Edmund warned. "Because it already is." And so, the next phase began, not in courtrooms or labs, but in the quiet spaces of a home-turned headquarters. A family forged by chance now stood ready to protect the man who had once saved them. Not with anger, but with intellect. Not with vengeance, but with vision. The betrayal hurt deeply, but it also revealed something more powerful. These children, these so-called orphans, weren't just the recipients of Richard's legacy. They were becoming it. And soon Catherine Hale would discover that the man she tried to erase had found something far more enduring than a board seat or a company name. He had found purpose again, and this time, it wasn't something she could vote away. The morning began like any other. The sun rose behind the pine-lined ridge beyond Lake Willoughby, casting its familiar glow across the Campbell estate. Inside the house, the scent of French toast drifted through the air, mingled with cinnamon and laughter. Toby was showing Eloise how to fold napkins into plant shapes, while Connor adjusted the settings on the smart thermostat to turn the living room into a tropical climate zone. Micah was curled up in the bay window, sketching the fog over the lake. Upstairs, Jackson was already dressed, reviewing a mock presentation he had prepared for Richard, a strategic pitch they'd been working on to counter the merger plans from Neurovita's new leadership. Richard came down the stairs slower than usual. He moved carefully, one hand on the railing, the other clutching the wall like he didn't quite trust the floor beneath him. He didn't say much, just nodded to the kids, gave Eloise a faint smile, and made his way to the library. No coffee, no breakfast, just the silence of a man carrying something heavier than he let on. Jackson followed. He found Richard seated in the leather armchair, eyes closed, fingers gently tracing the surface of the prototype cuff on his wrist. Jackson approached carefully, placing the folder with the revised merger counter-proposal on the side table. "You all right?" he asked. Richard opened his eyes, smiled faintly. "Just a little tired." "You've been saying that a lot lately." Richard didn't deny it. He looked at Jackson, really looked at him, and nodded. "I'm proud of you," he said. "All of you, what you're building. I couldn't have dreamed of it." "Good," Jackson said. "Because we're not done yet." Richard chuckled, softly. "No, I suppose we're not." He tried to stand, but halfway up, his hand slipped from the armrest. A sharp intake of breath, a falter in his step, and then he crumpled, his body folding in on itself like something that had simply given up, mid-dash motion. Jackson was on the floor before Richard hit it. "Richard," he shouted, shaking his shoulder. "Gently, Richard, stay with me." From the kitchen, Eloise heard the cry. She dropped a tray and came running, heart in her throat. The twins bolted from the basement. Micah froze halfway down the stairs, sketchpad falling from his hands. Toby stood in the hallway, paralyzed, a napkin still in his hand, shaped like a daffodil. The cuff on Richard's wrist blinked red. Jackson, his hands steady despite the chaos, pulled out the synced tablet and read the vitals. Heart rate erratic, oxygen levels dropping, blood pressure unreadable. "Call 911, he barked. Now Eloise grabbed the phone. Connor ran for the emergency kit they had prepared weeks ago just in case. never believing they would actually need it. Caleb opened the front gate from the wall panel, knowing an ambulance would be coming soon. Jackson tilted Richard's head gently, trying to keep his airway clear. His mind raced with everything he had read, every diagram, every protocol. "Come on," he whispered. "You don't get to leave yet." Micah moved closer, kneeling beside Jackson, his hand trembling as he took Richard's. "I don't know what to do," he said, voice cracking. "Just stay," Jackson replied. "He needs to know he's not alone." Outside, the sound of sirens began to rise, distant at first, then closer, cutting through the stillness of the Vermont morning. The paramedics arrived in minutes. They moved quickly, professionally, asking questions no one had time to answer. Richard was loaded onto a stretcher, the prototype cuff still blinking faintly on his wrist. As they carried him out, the children stood together in the entryway, 5 silhouettes against the bright light of the open door. "Are you family?" one of the EMTs asked. Jackson looked at the others, then back at the medic. "Yes," he said, "we are." They rode together in the back of Eloise's car, following the ambulance all the way to St. Johnsbury Medical Center. The sky had turned gray by the time they arrived, as if even the weather understood that something vital had slipped out of balance. Hours passed. Doctors moved in and out. Machines beeped and blinked. Paperwork was signed. Consent forms discussed. It was a blur of sterile lights and clipped language, all while Richard lay in a room that smelled of antiseptic and held the quiet weight of uncertainty. Finally, a physician emerged. "He's stable," she said, "for now, but his heart, it's failing faster than we expected. Whatever time we thought he had, it's less now." The words didn't hit like thunder. They hit like a dull, heavy silence. The kind that wraps itself around your chest and just sits there. Toby began to cry, not loudly, but quietly, like someone who didn't quite know what grief was, only that it was real. Micah sat down, opened his sketchpad with shaking hands, and began to draw Richard as he last remembered him, sitting in the garden, surrounded by green sunlight on his face. The twins just stood together, side by side, not speaking, and Jackson, he walked to the hospital window and stared out at the parking lot. Cars came and went. Life moved on. But for them, everything had stopped. He felt it then, the kind of weight that leadership brings. Not the cleverness of strategy, not the thrill of invention, but the unbearable responsibility of love. The man who saved them had fallen, and it was up to them now to find a way to lift him back up, even if they had to carry him through the fire to do it. The storm wasn't coming anymore, it was here. The morning after Richard's collapse dawned pale and silent, as though the entire world had paused to decide what came next. In the hospital room, he lay motionless under thin white sheets, his face colorless, his chest rising and falling beneath a fragile rhythm of machine-fed breath. The cuff, the one the children had built, blinked steadily at his wrist, still doing its job, still holding on. But it wasn't just the device that was keeping hope alive. It was them. Back at the estate, the house felt like a hollow memory. No footsteps on the stairs. No laughter over cereal. Just empty rooms, filled with everything they had built together, now waiting for something, for someone to come back. But grief wasn't what filled the air. Not yet. What filled it was resolve. In the living room, Jackson stood by the fireplace, papers spread across the table. The others sat nearby, each still wearing yesterday's clothes, sleep-deprived but alert. "We don't wait," Jackson said, voice steady. "If we wait, they'll move forward with the merger. If we wait, they'll bury his work and erase him from the company he built. If we wait, we lose." No one questioned him. They had seen enough, lost enough, learned enough to know. Waiting had never been part of Richard's story. He had built everything with urgency, with vision, and now, it was their turn. Caleb and Connor began with the prototype. They upgraded the software, fine-tuned the sensitivity, and added a new feature, automatic data export to cloud storage. If Richard's vitals spiked, the system would notify doctors, but now it would also notify the board. No more hiding his condition. No more ignoring what they were fighting for. Micah, usually quiet in a crisis, became the voice. He spent hours designing a digital presentation, not just medical charts, but a story. A visual narrative showing who Richard was, what he had built, and why Neurovita couldn't afford to lose that legacy. His sketches became moving illustrations, each one carefully rendered, a younger Richard working through the night. His wife Grace in the garden, the 5 of them seated at his table, the word family softly underlined. Toby sat beside him, whispering ideas and handing over small drawings of his own hopeful things. Trees, sunlight, a heart with roots. They need to feel it, Micah said. Not just understand it, feel it. Jackson reached out to Edmund Shore. The old lawyer was hesitant at first, unsure about giving 5 minors access to sensitive legal documents. But when Jackson calmly laid out their plan, a campaign to block the merger by invoking Richard's legacy patents, the ethics clause in the board's bylaws, and the public goodwill that still surrounded his name, Edmund went quiet. Then he asked, "Do you need help, ... or just space?" Jackson answered without blinking, "We need you to get us in the room." And Edmund did. He arranged a virtual presentation for the board, scheduled 3 days later. Jackson would lead the pitch. Micah would handle visuals. Caleb and Connor would walk through the biometric innovations they'd developed. Toby would close with a personal message, the simplest, truest kind. In the days leading up, they worked like soldiers, focused, sharp, determined, and yet, they weren't adults. They were still kids. There were moments when fear crept in late at night, when the rooms were too quiet, or when one of them woke from a dream of sirens. In those moments, they didn't talk about Richard, they just sat close, passed flashlights back and forth, told stories, waited for the dark to lift. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a strange calm. The children dressed in what they had, jackets borrowed from Richard's closet, hair combed carefully, shoes shined as best they could. They sat in front of the laptop like a strange, brilliant army. The screen filled with faces, some familiar, others cold and distant. Catherine Hale sat front and center, her expression unreadable. Jackson began. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He presented. He spoke of Richard's innovations, of his lifelong commitment to ethics in medicine, of the technologies that had saved lives and could save more still. Then he pivoted to the biometric cuff, a project born not in a lab, but in a basement, built by children who had been discarded by a system but lifted by one man's belief in them. Micah's images moved across the screen. Like poetry, not flashy, not sentimental, just honest. Caleb and Connor explained how the system worked, how it could be scaled, how the data they had collected already showed signs of impact, not only in Richard's care, but potentially across heart failure patients, nationwide. And then Toby stepped forward. He looked into the camera, holding up the original sprig of lavender he had picked for Richard months ago, now pressed between the pages of a book. "This is from the garden," he said. "It's small, but it still smells good. Mr. Richard says some things take time to grow, but he never gave up on us. So, please don't give up on him." The screen was silent. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the computer fan. Then one of the board members, an older woman named Judith, who had once worked with Grace, leaned in. "I vote no on the merger," she said. "Not after this." One by one, others followed. When it was over, the merger was dead. Richard's name would remain on the masthead. His influence protected. The board, shaken from its sleep by 5 unexpected voices, had listened. Back at the hospital, Richard opened his eyes. It was late afternoon. The room was quiet, save for the soft beep of machines. He looked down at his wrist and saw the cuff blinking green. And beside him, asleep in the chairs, on the floor, heads resting on each other's shoulders, were the children, not waiting, keeping watch. And when he smiled, it was faint, tired, but real. Because in the end, they had done what he once did for them. They had refused to let him be forgotten. They had risen. 5 against the world. And the world this time had listened. The hospital room was still. The only sounds, the soft rhythm of Richard's breathing, and the periodic pulse of machines monitoring his fragile heartbeat. It had been 48 hours since he'd collapsed, and while his condition had stabilized, the threat still loomed like a shadow in the doorway, uninvited, unwelcome, and unmoved by sentiment. But something else stirred now, something the doctors hadn't anticipated. Hope. Not the vague, abstract kind, but structured, coded, measurable hope. It arrived in the form of 5 children and a tablet. Dr. Alina Morales, the attending cardiologist, was used to long nights, impossible cases, and data that rarely surprised her anymore. But when she walked into the family consultation room and found Jackson seated at the head of the table, flanked by his siblings, each holding a folder, a sketchpad, or a prototyped, she paused. Then she sat down. "We'd like to walk you through something," Jackson said calmly. 15 minutes. That's all we ask. Dr. Morales folded her arms. "And you are?" "We're his family," he said. The presentation began. Micah, went first. His drawings laid the foundation, a narrative of Richard's medical history, his decline, and the absence of a comprehensive monitoring tool that could respond in real time. His hand-drawn timeline didn't just show numbers, it illustrated feelings, progressions, the invisible toll that standard charts couldn't quite capture. Then Caleb and Connor took over. They introduced the biometric cuff, its sensors, its data model, the cloud syncing process, the response algorithms. They explained how they had retrofitted components from other devices, how the cuff could alert caregivers within seconds of a crisis, how it had already done so during Richard's collapse. "We can show you the live logs," Connor said, holding up the tablet. "Here's his heart rate at 7:52 a.m. to irregular spikes. Then, a drop. That's when he fell." Caleb added, "And here, 7:57, the signal went out. It auto-sent vitals to this endpoint, which we built. It gave us a 3-minute head start calling 911. Dr. Morales leaned forward, her brow furrowed, not in disbelief, but focus. "You're telling me this device gave you advance warning?" she asked. "It bought him time," Jackson answered. She reviewed the data. It was crude in format, no medical polish, but it was clean, continuous, and startlingly accurate. "This wasn't just an alert system," she said softly. "This was proactive telemetry." Micah nodded. "We didn't have FDA approvals or hospital access. We had instinct. And someone we didn't want to lose." Toby stepped forward next, holding a small stack of papers. Crayon-colored diagrams sat atop more formal ones. He pointed to one with a cartoon heart and a smiling face. "I helped make the herbs," he said. "They're not medicine, but they make him calmer. Lavender, peppermint, chamomile." Dr. Morales smiled for the first time. Jackson brought it all home. He pulled out a folder marked Neura Vita Legacy Platform and placed it gently on the table. "This," he said, "was supposed to be Richard's next phase. Integrative monitoring. Preventive response. He didn't get the chance to finish it. So, we did." Dr. Morales sat back, processing. "This is ... impressive. But it's not just about the tech, it's about application. Evidence." "You have it," Jackson said. "Right now, his chart, his vitals, this system, they all align. He's alive because of this." Dr. Morales paused. Her eyes shifted toward the tablet again. "You want me to recommend its use in his care plan?" "We want you to take it seriously," Jackson said. "We don't care about credit. We care about him." She stood up, holding the tablet, and walked toward the door. "Give me 24 hours, she said. "I'm taking this to the review board." The room exhaled as she left. Hours later, Richard opened his eyes to find all 5 kids surrounding him. He was groggy, disoriented, but their faces brought him back. "You're still here," he whispered. "Double quotes, always," Toby said. The next afternoon, Dr. Morales returned. Her face was unreadable at first, but her tone was not. "The board's never seen anything like this," she said. "But after reviewing your device's performance and its impact, we're authorizing continued use as part of an experimental protocol. You'll still receive traditional care, but the cuff stays." Richard looked at Jackson, then to each of the children, his voice thin but certain. "You did this." They nodded. "You didn't just build something," he said slowly. "You saved me." There were no grand speeches, just quiet tears, a hand squeeze, a long hug that no one wanted to end. What they had created wasn't a miracle. It was proof. Proof that ingenuity and love, when fused with purpose, could challenge even the most rigid institutions. Proof that children, so often underestimated, could not only belong in the room, but lead it. Proof that family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you fought for, healed inside of, and built your future around. Outside, spring bloomed fully. And in a small hospital room in Vermont, 6 lives beat on, each one stronger for the others. The heart, after all, was never meant to survive alone. The first time Richard walked again, truly walked, without nurses flanking his sides or machines humming behind him, it was barely 5 steps from his hospital bed to the window. But to the 5 children watching from their seats, it was 1,000 miles. A journey back from the edge. The sun poured through the glass that afternoon, warming the floor in golden patches. Outside, the trees had blossomed, and a breeze stirred petals into flight like tiny paper promises. He stood there, hand resting lightly on the windowsill, breathing in the moment. It wasn't easy. His heart still beat with uneven effort, and the doctors were cautious. But something in his eyes, the clarity, the quiet conviction, made it clear. He had no intention of slipping quietly back into the dark. He turned, and they were all there. Jackson calm, but visibly holding back emotion. Micah, sketchbook in hand, capturing Richard mid-silhouette. Caleb and Connor, each nodding, as if to say, "We knew you would." And little Toby, hands pressed together, whispering thank you not to Richard, but to the air itself, to the universe, to whatever power had let this day happen. Richard took another step. Each day afterward, he gained a little more strength in his voice, color in his cheeks, sparked behind his words. It wasn't a miracle recovery. The doctors were careful to remind him of that, but what they couldn't measure was the kind of healing that doesn't come from prescriptions or procedures. The kind that comes from being loved back to life. Back at the estate, the house had been prepared with quiet optimism. Eloise made sure everything was just as it had been, but warmer, softer. The twins had rewired the front door to respond to Richard's voice command. Micah had painted a mural in the sunroom. 5 children, 1 man, and a tree that reached toward the sky, blooming not with leaves, but with small paper hearts. Toby had placed a potted rosemary plant by Richard's nightstand, "For your memory," he said, "and your peace." The day Richard returned home, the driveway was lined with paper lanterns. Not because anyone told the kids to did it, one for each day he had been in the hospital. 47 in total, glowing quietly as the Jeep pulled in under the early evening light. He stepped out slowly, cane in hand, and stood on the gravel path leading to his front door. The children stood beside him, forming a line that mirrored the very first night they had arrived. Cold, uncertain, silent. Only this time, they weren't strangers. They weren't waiting to be welcomed. They were welcoming him home. Inside, they gathered in the living room. No fanfare, no speeches, just shared glances, the passing of stories. Connor told a joke about the hospital Wi-Fi. Caleb showed off a new update to the biometric cuff. Micah handed Richard a sketch of him, standing in the window that first day he walked. The caption underneath read, "You chose to matter, so we did too." And Jackson, who had said the least throughout the ordeal, simply placed the Neurovita file back on the coffee table. "You don't have to go back," he said, "but you should know, you still own it. And they know it. Now." Richard smiled. "I don't need to run the company," he replied. "I just want to build something that matters. Something that doesn't die when I do." "You already have," Jackson said. The next week, Richard met with Dr. Morales and her team, with the children at his side. They discussed a collaboration, a pilot program using the cuff technology for rural patients without reliable monitoring. Richard insisted the children be listed as co-designers. When a junior consultant objected, saying, "They're just kids," Richard replied without missing a beat. So was Edison when he built his first invention. In the months that followed, the world outside began to take notice. Not of Richard Campbell, tech magnate and founder of Neurovita, but of something better. A man who fell, and was lifted not by fortune or fame, but by 5 unlikely voices that refused to let him be forgotten. A man who had chosen, in the final chapter of his life, to become something greater than a name on a building. He chose to become a father, a mentor, a believer in second chances. The cuff became known as the Hope Band. Clinics in New England began requesting prototypes. Researchers reached out. Media outlets ran stories, some overly polished, others raw and intimate, but none could capture what really happened in that house on the hill, because what happened wasn't a product launch. It was a resurrection. One night, Richard stood again at the window of his study, the same place he had stood the night he first saw 5 children huddled in the cold. He touched the cuff on his wrist, blinking softly in green. He breathed in the stillness. Behind him, footsteps padded down the hall, the quiet sound of someone he loved. Still awake, still moving, still living under the same roof. And for the first time in his life, Richard Campbell, builder, once lonely man, felt not powerful, not brilliant, not admired. He felt whole. His pulse was back, not just in his body, but in his purpose, in his people. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. By the time autumn rolled in again, the maple trees around the Campbell estate had turned to fire, gold, crimson, and deep rust, blanketing the grounds in soft color. The seasons had come full circle, just as the lives within the home had. A year had passed since Richard had opened his door to 5 children huddled in the snow. A year since he had faced his own fading heartbeat and chosen, not to retreat quietly into legacy, but to live more deeply into it. The house was no longer a monument to what had been. It had become a place in motion. Walls once silent now echoed. with the rhythm of life, not loud or chaotic, but deeply alive. Mornings were filled with a soft hum of projects restarting, bread rising in the kitchen, and footsteps down polished hallways. Evenings meant shared meals, chess games, half-finished sketches, and the occasional science experiment that left the twins covered in soot and grinning. But beneath it all, something more permanent had taken root, not in brick or blueprint, but in something richer, something that would outlive any building or patent. Legacy. Not the kind carved on marble or printed in annual reports, but the kind that breathes. It started with the launch of the Campbell Hope Initiative, a foundation co-led by Richard and the children, built not just to distribute the biometric cuff, but to reimagine how rural and underserved communities could access preventative care. The pilot programs in New England had turned into full-scale adoption in dozens of counties. Hospitals began training techs using the twins' modular sensor kits. Nurses were using Micah's visual guides, simple, elegant, and effective, to teach patients how to read their own data. Toby became the unofficial face of the herbal wellness program. His garden kits for heart peace, little boxes with calming herbs, instructions, and messages like "you are still growing," were shipped to recovering patients around the country. Hospitals began requesting more than just cuffs. They wanted gardens. They wanted care that felt human. Jackson, now applying to colleges early, with full scholarships from 3 different universities, had spoken at 2 medical technology conferences. Not once did he talk about numbers. He talked about what it meant to matter, about how data without heart is just noise, about how, sometimes, the smallest decision, like letting 5 cold children into your home, is the one that changes everything. Mika's mural in the sunroom had expanded. Now it stretched from wall to ceiling, filled with stories in brushstroke. Richard planting seeds with Toby, the twins wiring circuit boards under warm lamplight, Eloise laughing over burnt cookies, Jackson standing behind Richard in front of a projector screen. At the very center, a single phrase, written in looping charcoal script: "We became real here." Richard didn't attend every meeting. He didn't need to. His role had changed, not absent, but elevated. Like a lighthouse, steady, watching, trusting. The ones he once guided to carry the flame further than he ever could alone. He spent more time in the garden now, sometimes alone. Often with Toby, or Eloise, or all of them at once. He kept a journal, not of business plans or deadlines, but of moments. The way Connor squinted when he was solving something. The sound of Micah's pencil at night. The quiet relief on Jackson's face when he thought no one was watching. These were the entries that mattered now. He received invitations to return to Neurovita, to sit on panels, to advise, mentor, consult. Sometimes he said yes, sometimes no, but he no longer felt the need to prove himself. His contribution had shifted. It no longer sat in code, or stock, or strategy, but in 5 people who walked through the world because he had chosen to. Love them when he had every reason to close the door. One crisp October afternoon, Richard stood by the lake, watching the wind ripple across the surface. Behind him, the house glowed in amber light. Inside, laughter rose from the kitchen. Someone had put music on, something old and familiar, likely from Grace's old vinyls. He could hear Micah humming along, Caleb asking for more sugar, and Eloise pretending she hadn't already added too much. He pressed his fingers lightly to the inside of his wrist. The cuff still blinked, not to remind him of what he might lose, but to remind him of what he had gained. Legacy, he had learned, wasn't a thing you left behind. It was a thing you built, one choice at a time. A warm meal, a risk taken, a child seen, a second chance offered when no one else would. It was family. It was roots. And it was the pulse of something that wouldn't stop when he finally did. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting the last golden light across the water, Richard turned back toward the house, steady now, unafraid, and walked toward the life he'd chosen. And as the door opened, 5 voices called out from within, not in fear, not in need, but in welcome. "Dad," they shouted, and he smiled, because in the end, that was the name that mattered most.